Okay, class. So for the second and final lesson, we'll talk about some of the specific methods that Martin Luther King puts forward in Letter from Birmingham Jail. Specifically, his methods for nonviolent protests, but also his methods for distinguishing just from unjust laws. So to begin with, he goes through what he considers four steps for any nonviolent campaign. And I'll try to go through these slowly and explain why each one of them is important. And then at the end, I'll also explain what some further steps are that are at least implied there. So to begin with, he says, the first step in any sort of nonviolent campaign is the collection of facts. And by that, he means research. It means looking back at what exactly are the laws, who passed these laws, when, how are they enforced, by what means are they enforced, what sort of negotiation has taken place in the past, what are the results of the negotiation, are people keeping with that, etc. So in other words, research about the situation. Now you might be wondering, why does somebody like King, living in the segregationist South, need to do research, right? You might think it's there in front of everybody's face that there's this fundamental injustice, fundamental inequality written into these Jim Crow laws. Why does there need to be research? But it's important to see for somebody like King, you've got to be able to make your case in a clear and informed way, precisely in order to convince those people who are on the fence. Last lesson, we talked about how his primary audience for a letter from Birmingham Jail are those people who are on the fence, who aren't yet getting involved, who don't yet have a call to conscience about this great injustice. And so, yes, on one hand, the injustice is obvious to anybody who's paying attention. But for somebody like King, it's very important that his side be perceived as the side of reason, the side of truth, and the side of a well-informed, well-crafted argument. And in contrast, obviously, he's well-positioned the opponents, the segregationists, to come across as ignorant, as lying, as not having the facts, and as basically fishing around from one myth to another to try to justify their racist laws. So that's the first step. The second step is negotiation. And by negotiation, obviously what he means is when both sides sit down and have a rational discussion. One of the complaints that those moderate white clergy members that he's responding to had was they said, King, why aren't you just negotiating? What's all this, protesting? Why don't you believe in negotiation? And he's at pains to say, no, we tried that. We very much believe in negotiation, and we tried negotiation. And he says we tried negotiating with the city fathers in Birmingham, and they didn't negotiate in good faith. Then we tried negotiating with the merchants directly, and they didn't negotiate in good faith. They would promise us stuff and not fulfill the promises. And so he says we only had to go beyond that because the negotiation failed. But for King, it's very important that you at least try negotiation, even if you know it might fail, right? Even if you know that the person that you're negotiating with on the other side of the table hates you, doesn't consider you an equal human being, and there's no way that they're going to, through rational discussion, agree to that. He still thought that that was an important step to take, such that you can say, we only went further as a last resort. We tried rational discussion. But as he predicts, one of the things he says is that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressors. It must be demanded, right? And so it plays out here in terms of negotiation. What he found, which I think he was expecting, is if you are in a disempowered state, if you are not already considered equal to others, in a sense, you don't have much of a negotiating position or any negotiation position to enter into, right? But still for King, and again, it goes back to that idea of the kind of Sisyphean struggle, you still have to try what you know might not be effective in order to be on the side of justice. So that's the second step. You might think, yeah, you go right from there to the protests, but no, instead there's a step that he calls self-purification. And for me, this part might be a little confusing. Why is it that if King knows that he's on the side of justice and what is right, why does he and his followers need to go through some process of self-purification? It seems like they already are pure, right? So let's try to understand what he means by self-purification. It's here that what he's talking about is training in nonviolence, training in purifying from yourself those natural instincts that you have to respond to violence against you with violence against others, right? And one of the things that he's kind of acknowledging here is, yeah, it is the natural thing to do when somebody is beating you with a club to respond violently. It is the natural thing when people are bombing you and lynching you, etc., to respond with violence. That seems natural. But what he wants to get to is it's not inevitable. There's a higher way, a better way, right? And the nonviolent path, even though it's not your instinctive path, it is the more powerful and more effective and more righteous path. And so King thought you need to be trained to be able to take that path. This is not inevitable. This is not natural. And so literally what this meant for King's followers was they would have to go through a kind of training process in which there was kind of role playing, and you would have somebody get in your face and yell at you and kind of about to hit you. And the question is, can you respond to that without getting riled up, without getting violent? And also, can you face jail time? Can you face that? And the idea was to train people in advance for all of the violence that they would face and the unjust persecution they would face, and to be able to tell who's able to do that and respond peacefully. Right? And one of the things that was very important for King was this to establish a fundamental asymmetry between his protesters and the police forces and the rabid segregationists who were opposing them and confronting them violently. One of the things that King was a master of is using the media, newspapers, television, etc. And he made sure that these protests were shown nationally. And people who live through the time will often have to remember seeing on the nightly news daily film reels of nonviolent protesters who are often dressed in coat and tie, just sitting peacefully on the sidewalk while they're being beaten with batons, hit with fire hoses, attacked by dogs. In a sense, King wanted people to see this. Why? Because he wanted people to see there's an absolute asymmetry between the people who are asking for their freedom and asking for their basic rights and dignity, and those people wanting to deprive it of them. Right? He knew that if instead it devolved into violence against violence, then people would say, yeah, there's violence on both sides. Who's to say who's right? But he wanted to eliminate that. He wanted to give people a very clear sense of good versus evil, right? And nonviolence allowed him to do that, right? And so this is, this kind of call to conscience was very much empowered by this nonviolence, which made for this great asymmetry between the people who are peacefully protesting and the people who are violently trying to deny those protesters their basic rights. Right, so that's self-purification, and then the four-step direct action, that's King's term for these protests, things like marches, things like sit-ins, etc. These were the literal forms of protest by which people refused to leave the lunch counter, right? They just sat there even though they were told, blacks aren't allowed here, right? Or they protested even though they were told, or marched even though they were told, you don't have an order to parade on this day. So you're not able to do that. Now I put this in parentheses because he lists just 4 steps, but one thing that he makes very clear is the point of direct action, the point of these protests, boycotts, sit-ins, etc., is precisely to bring the opponent back to a state of negotiation, we might call renegotiation, from an empowered stance, right? And the idea was that having boycotted, having disrupted these people's businesses, having shown them that the African American community does have a voice, and even if they're not yet legally equal, they still have certain powers that they could bring down, then they're willing to go back to the negotiating table. And this is exactly what King thought needed to happen. But it's important to realize that the direct action of the protests is not the end of it. His point was to bring people back to the negotiating table. But that's not the only point that he's trying to do. I mean, if you read Letter from Birmingham Jail, it makes it seem like his mission is to go from city to city and town to town throughout the South, confronting the city leaders in each one, the merchants in each one, and slowly, city by city, town by town, changing the South. This is not exactly King's plan, even though presumably he would be happy to do that if that's what it took. But his plan is much more national, as I've been saying all along. His real plan was for all of America to see what's happening here in Birmingham, for example, and saying, that is wrong, that is unjust. I need to do something about this, right? I need to get involved in ending this injustice and in making segregation and the unfair treatment of African Americans a national issue, right? And that's really what the direct action and the media attention on that is very much there to make this a national story of good versus evil, and to let people see that what King is doing is very much in continuity with the original struggle for freedom that defines America, and to bring people to that point of conscience that Thoreau wanted to bring them to, that Jefferson wanted to bring them to, which is you need to be able to get involved when injustices are confronting others, even if you're not yet personally involved, not personally afflicted by those injustices. Okay, so those are the steps of his plan for civil disobedience, nonviolent protests. The next thing to talk about is this objection that he addresses, which is, look, it might be that your cause is just, right, and that African Americans should be treated equally and segregation should end, but look, you're breaking the law. This is something that the moderate clergyman that he's responding to said is, look, you ought to be ashamed of yourself that you're breaking the law because, right, you're supposed to be a clergy member. You're supposed to be an upstanding member of community, and yet you keep going to jail. When King went to jail in Birmingham, that was the 13th time he had been to jail, right? And for a lot of people, they thought, this is shameful, right? I mean, even if your cause is just, think about how shameful it is that you keep being put in jail, right? One of the things that King does in response to that is he evokes Socrates. And he says, yeah, that's as if it's Socrates' fault that they put him in jail and eventually make him drink hemlock because he stood up for the truth and virtue, right? But one thing to bear in mind here is Socrates himself faced this exact objection in the Apology when they say Socrates, or at least he kind of imagines them, Socrates kind of imagines his accusers saying, Socrates, aren't you ashamed to be at a trial for your life? Aren't you ashamed to go to jail or be punished? So yeah, maybe your cause is just, maybe you're talking about virtue, but isn't it shameful to go to jail? But Socrates says, no, it's shameful to not go to jail. That's cowardly. In the face of injustice, if you're doing the right thing, then going to jail is the honorable thing to do, right? And that starts a long tradition of what you might call kind of jailhouse philosophy, right? Philosophy that's done literally from a jail cell or from exile, right? And so you see this for Socrates. You see it for somebody like Boethius, writing in exile and about to be executed. You see it in Thoreau, right, reflecting from a jail cell about the nature of freedom and dignity. And Thoreau says, the only place where a just person can rest their head in a state that's unjust is in a jail, because that shows that you've paid your dues. Right? That shows that you were willing to risk something for the sake of justice, and it's the honorable thing to do. Right? So it's important to see that King is really tapping into this long-standing tradition within philosophy of this thing I call jailhouse philosophy. But what Thoreau says is, look, the only obligation I have at any moment is to follow my own individual conscience. And so if I run across a law that I think is unjust, my conscience bids me to break it. I should break it. Thoreau's clear. I still need to go to jail and be punished for it. But the criteria for whether a law is just or unjust, Thoreau is content to say that's going to be subjective. That's going to be based on your own individual conscience. King disagrees with this, and this is one of the major differences between a thinker like King and Thoreau. King wants there to be clear, objective, communally understood criteria for when laws are just or unjust, and therefore for when it's acceptable to break a law for the sake of justice. Right? And so this is one of the things that he sets out in Letter from Birmingham Jail, is what criteria are acceptable criteria that you can use to tell whether a law is just or unjust. Right? And so I have them here. The first one he says is, a just law will square with the moral law, which he also calls the law of God. Right? He's thinking, of course, as a minister there, he's thinking this is God's law. But he's also addressing this primarily as a philosophical text, and he's saying, laws that violate the moral law, whatever that might be, are unjust, right? And laws that square with the moral law are just, right? And so this is meant to be a kind of objective criteria for telling one from the other, right? And so you can think back to the sorts of principles that we learn in people like Kant and in Mill, right? You might say, look, if a law treats anybody as a means only or not fully worthy of dignity, that is an unjust law that you can break and maybe should break, right? But a law that treats everybody as having full dignity would be a just law. So that's the first criteria. The second one, he talks about personhood. And what he means by personhood is, he talks about personality. And what he means by that is not kind of personality like how fun you are. What he means is personhood. He says some laws uplift personality. By that he means they uplift personhood. And I think that the best word to really capture what he's getting at here is dignity. Some laws uphold the dignity of everyone, and those are just laws. In contrast, a law that, he says, degrades personality, degrades personhood or dignity is an unjust law, and that law can and perhaps should be broken. The third criteria is, he says, some laws are laws that are passed by a majority on a minority, and the majority doesn't have to follow it, just the minority. And he says this is difference made legal, difference made law. And he says any law that does that, any law that instantiates a fundamental difference between people, a fundamental inequality among people, is necessarily an unjust law. And in contrast, a just law is one in which sameness is made legal. You might say, a better word for that would be equality is made legal. Right? Any law that respects each person as equal before the law is a just law. But any one that makes some people unequal to others is necessarily an unjust law. Right? And it's very clear how segregationist laws do exactly that. The fourth one that he mentions is, he talks about how was this law made, right? And he says, in the South here, due to voter suppression, African Americans don't have the voice that they would need to give consent to those laws, right? And so any law that is passed in the presence of voter suppression, and to use the Lockean term, without the consent of the governed, is necessarily an unjust law. But a just law is one in which there's no voter suppression, in which everybody that's affected by the law had their fair say, right? And to use the Lockean term, he's talking about by consent of the governed, right? And so you can see, on one hand, he's really tapping into this longstanding understanding of human rights that goes at least all the way back to Locke, if not before then. And he's trying to say, look, we have been denied these fundamental rights due to the laws in place. So to tell us that we ought to follow the laws simply means that we should violate and accept the violation of our own rights. And he says that's absolutely unacceptable. Any law that violates your fundamental rights is an unjust law. This is something that Locke, Jefferson, Thoreau, etc. would all agree with. Okay, so then the next thing to talk about is, once we are clear about what laws would be justified in breaking, the next thing to mull over is the issue of punishment. And I'll read this quote from the letter. He says, "One who breaks an unjust law must do so openly, lovingly, and with a willingness to accept the penalty. I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust, and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law." Right? So let's try to break that down. So first of all, he says, it's not just a matter of telling which laws it's okay to break. It's a matter of breaking them in the right way. Right? So he says you need to do so openly. In other words, you can't just be secretly getting away with breaking a law. You need to do so openly, publicly. Exactly, you can think of his kind of protests where he's publicly protesting, right, in a place where he's not supposed to be protesting. That's technically the law he broke in Birmingham. He does not have a permit to parade, and yet he's marching, right? It needs to be done lovingly, right? In other words, again, it goes back to the self-purification without hatred in your heart, right? You need to do this for the sake of justice and not for the sake of, say, purely yourself or at kind of bringing somebody else down. You have to do it with the kind of love of everybody involved. But then the last part, I think, is also, it's difficult to understand, with the willingness to accept the penalty. And you might think, look, if let's suppose I use these criteria and I identify a law that I think is totally unjust, it might be very unclear why, if I'm justified in breaking that law, why wouldn't I be justified in getting away with it? Right? Why is it that if I don't respect the law, if I think the law is unjust, why would I accept punishment for that law? Right? Why would I go to jail for breaking a law that I think is unjust, rather than kind of doing it secretly and getting away with it? Again, you can take this back to Thoreau, because Thoreau was also very clear about this. Going to jail, accepting the punishment, is not a result of the civil disobedience. It's part of the civil disobedience, and it's an essential part of the civil disobedience. So for Thoreau, not paying his taxes was the first part of his civil disobedience, but the second part was going to jail for it. And in fact, Thoreau was quite annoyed when his aunt paid the money and got him out of jail. He only had to spend one night in jail. He was very annoyed by that. But the point here is that going to jail, accepting that punishment, for people like Thoreau and King, is absolutely essential to the civil disobedience itself. And let's try to understand why. For one thing, it distinguishes the person who breaks this law out of conscience and out of a will to change the law from the person who's just trying to get away with something, right? You can imagine a scenario where, let's suppose I don't believe in the speed limit. I think, I love driving, down the Mass Pike at, 120, and I think, I should have the right to do that, right? What's the difference between me and somebody who is what's the difference between me and somebody like Martin Luther King? Well, probably I don't want to get punished for that, right? I don't want to get arrested or get a fine, et cetera, right? And so, the cops are behind me and I'm, trying to escape them, right? This is not civil disobedience, right? Why? Because I'm trying to break the law and get away with it, it's pretty clear I'm trying to break that law out of my own narrow self-interest. But if instead I take the punishment, then that makes it clear that this is not a matter of my own self-interest, right? Think back to what Camus says about how the act of rebellion cannot be a matter of mere egoism. When you risk your life, it shows that. So too when you risk going to jail. That shows that you are willing to take a punishment, and that your action of rebellion, your action of civil disobedience, is not for your own sake, but rather for something greater than you, for justice itself, in order to have a better and more just community. And so King thinks, you have to accept this punishment, right? And like Thoreau, he thinks it is the noble thing to do, right? It distinguishes you from the scofflaw, who just is trying to avoid kind of breaking whatever laws they don't like to follow and getting away with it, right? The person who goes to jail for the sake of breaking the law is clearly doing so for something, a higher cause, right? But then let's also talk about this phrase. He says, it is in reality expressing the highest respect for law, right? And that might seem odd. So I'm breaking a law out of respect for law, and in fact, the highest respect for law. Let's try to understand that. One thing you can think about is, if I'm breaking a law that I think is unjust, I'm doing so in order to change that law. I want to eliminate that law and replace it with one that is more just. But if you think that laws themselves are there for the sake of justice, right? Laws have as their function to instantiate a just way of living, right? Then you can think, when I do something for the sake of justice, I'm doing it for the sake of law overall, right? Not this particular law, which might be unjust, but for law overall, right? And you can think, especially if I'm willing to go to jail, that shows that although I disrespect this particular law, right, the segregationist law or laws against protesting, on the other hand, I do believe in the legal system overall, right? I do believe in the authority system. I believe in the legal system, right? And so this, I think, is what King means by saying this. It expresses the highest respect for law, right? Because it shows, if I'm willing to break an unjust law and go to jail for it, that shows that I respect law, and in fact, you might say, I love justice so much I'm willing to go to jail for it, right? I love and yearn for a just set of laws so much that I'm willing to even take a punishment for it, even be killed for it. Okay, so then this brings us to reflection. So the first thing is, um, do you agree with King and Thoreau here that uh, somebody who breaks a law out of civil disobedience needs to accept the punishment? Or do you think that it makes sense that if I think a law is unjust, I should be able to break it and get away with it, right? And it makes no sense to go and accept a punishment for a law that I think is unjust. So that's the first part. And then the second thing about it is it's not just a matter of going to jail, right? And uh, starting with Socrates, right? Socrates, yeah, he goes to jail for a while, but then he's executed, right? And as I said before, this starts a whole a tradition of people who stand up against injustice and are killed for it, right? Or punished for it in some way, sent into exile, tortured, etc. Right? And really, in the history of philosophy, it seems like most great thinkers face some form of persecution, if not outright death, for what they're doing, for standing up for what they believe in. And so I want you to think about the fact that, on one hand, philosophy is there to train you to live that examined life that Socrates talks about, and thereby to bring yourself into a state of happiness, to have a good life because you've examined your life. So now you're wiser about the goals that you seek. You're wiser about what is good versus what is evil, what is just versus unjust, right? You're wiser about how to find and know the just thing to do, right? And all that's supposed to be aiming at a happier life. But on the other hand, you can also see, reading between the lines here, philosophy is also training in how to sacrifice your life for something beyond yourself, right? And clearly King is just one of a whole history of people who do exactly that. When King was finally assassinated, that was one of many attempts on his life, and something that he knew very well was a likely outcome of what he's doing. And so for the second part of your reflection, I want you to simply ask yourself, is that an acceptable outcome for you? Could you imagine any scenario in which you would be willing to risk your life for something you believe in? Or do you think that that's too extreme and not worthwhile? And that philosophy, which seems to aim at your happiness, is just kind of self-defeating if it also goes so far as to lead you into a state where you're risking your life.